Hi everyone, welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be learning how to paint the Space Marine Chaplain with jump pack. He was in the new Armageddon 11th edition box set. Nice dynamic pose, jumping off a rock. So I decided to have him jumping over some hot lava. So in today's tutorial we'll learn how we can get that lava effect and how we can get the bouncing light reflections off of his black armour as well, for nice glowing effects. So to create the base, I stuck the old Chaplain down as normal, added some stones here, there and everywhere, and then used the Liquitex acrylic medium gloss gel, and you apply this like you would do any basing sort of material, like Sterling mud or something like that. And then you can use the brush to manipulate it to look like it's flowing lava, just by pulling the brush through into different shapes, like how lava would flow around the rocks, just so you get some natural sort of little valleys of lava that's flowing through. Leave it to dry. It does take a little bit of time to dry. I mean, we're in the middle of a heat wave here, so it only took about 20 minutes, but in reality it can take up to an hour to 2 hours, just depending on how thick you've applied it. Once it's dry, I then base coated everything in the Army Painter's matte black air primer through an airbrush, but you can just use a brush as well. So the first thing we're going to do is lay down our volumes using the airbrush. So as you know, the brighter the white, the more the intense fluorescent effect's going to be. So our first step is to get those volumes going. So what I'm trying to do is, looking at the shapes that I've created on the base, I'm aiming the airbrush directly into those little gullies so that you get the intense glow into those gullies, and then just adding little bits of the white around the surrounding areas so that you get those natural gradients from the really, really bright, intense white out to the sort of gradiented white. So when we apply the fluorescent paints over the top of this, where you've got those really, really bright whites, the fluorescence will shine even more compared to where it's slightly darker, and you'll get a less of a reflection from the fluorescent paints. I did thin down it's the Liquitex white ink that I'm using. I have thinned it down ever so slightly. It's only because we are in the middle of a heat wave in the UK at the moment. It's over 35 degrees. I've got the aircon on, but it's still really warm, so the ink was drying quite quickly on the tip of the airbrush, but I applied a little bit of flow improver and some thinners just to try and wet it down a little bit. But you've got to be careful with the inks because they're really wet anyway, so if you thin them down too much, it almost becomes uncontrollable. So you can see there where I've laid down the volumes, I've got the bright intensity where I want it to be bright, and then it's gradienting out. So the first fluorescent colour we're going to apply is the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Orange Yellow. So this is all sort of a pre-mixed colour in the Green Stuff World provide, and it's a nice rich lava-y orange yellow colour. It saves you having to do a layer of fluorescent yellow, waiting for it to dry, then do a layer of fluorescent orange over the top, kind of combined here to create a nice tone. And basically just a simple case here of covering everything using the airbrush with the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Orange Yellow. Take your time. A few thin coats is needed here. Don't try and cover it all in one go. It won't work. You need to apply multiple layers through the airbrush. If you try to apply one large layer through the airbrush, it will pull and spider web and just look terrible. So much like if you were painting, you paint in many layers, you also airbrush generally in many layers, just so that you get a nice coverage. Once you're happy with the coverage, we're then going to apply a darker tone, which is Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. I accidentally punctured the bottom of the hole as I was bottom of the bottle with an airbrush needle when I was stirring it. So that's why I've got the tape on the bottom. But that's Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. So what this darker tone will do is it will decrease the brightness but increase the warmth. It will give us that red fiery glow that we're looking for. Now what I'm doing, and it's hard to show here, but I hope you can sort of understand what I'm doing. I'm almost dry brushing with the airbrush. So I'm aiming the red so that the nozzle is pointed across the top of the base. So I'm only catching the very top of the lava and the stones that we've created. So what it will end up doing is leaving that orange in the very center, the orange yellow in the very sort of deepest parts, but with an overbrush of that fluorescent red, so that you're toning down the top part but maintaining that heat below. And I do this a few times, just as I said, lowering the brightness but increasing the warmth. And once I'm happy with that, I then, instead of washing out the airbrush, I add a little few drops of water and then some AK Tenebrous Grey. And what we'll then create is a very, very dark, very, very sort of a reddish purpley black colour, which is a nice colour to make it look like the very, very cool parts of lava, the crust on the top, the sort of basalt that gets created. So a few ways of doing this. First of all, I apply it directly on top of the stones because they'll be the coolest parts. I then do the sort of similar approach I did with the red, where I'm almost dry brushing it on with the airbrush, where I'm only touching the very, very tops of the rocks and the tips of the points of lava. We don't want to get this into the very, very cool areas, otherwise it will ruin the effect. Sorry, in the very, very bright areas, because we want those to remain bright. And you don't need a lot of this to make the areas look dark and cold. So that's what we've gone for here. The brighter the area, the hotter the area, the cooler the area, the darker the area. Make sure you give the airbrush a really good washout after this. That Tenebrous Grey is a very, very pigment rich colour, so it needs a good wash. We then move over to the wet palette, so we're on to brushwork now. That was it for the airbrush. We're now on to brushwork. So I use some AK Intense White. And what I'm going to do here is just sketch out where I want it to be bright, bright yellow, so really, really hot lava. And all I'm doing here, it's hard to see, but you'll catch it in a minute, is just trace a couple of lines where I'm going to overpaint it in a minute with some fluorescent yellow. So I'm just creating a few wiggly lines here and there where I want the hottest part to be. And that's in the central area of where you want that hot lava flow to be. So then you'd have a yellow strip, then it will cool out to the oranges and the reds. So this is just laying down the base of the white. So like we did with the airbrush, we're using white to really, really create an intense glowing effect when we go over the top of it with our fluorescent paints. Once you're happy with the design of how you've done your little lines, we then grab some AK fluorescent yellow and we apply this directly over the white and also either side of the white, so that we get a nice transition from the orange to the yellow intensity. Does need a couple of coats just so that you get a good even coverage, but this is the opportunity to do covering it over to increase the intensity of the brightness, and either side so that you get the gradiented look. So you could stop at this point. You've got yourself a really good lava effect. But I just wanted there was some flat areas that I just wanted to create some additional bits of cool rock. So I sketch in some outlines of some rock using AK blood red. Sorry, not blood red, AK black red. And then the inside of those little bits of rock I paint with AK tenebrous grey, just so that we get some little bits of cooling lava, just to break up some of the flatter areas that there were. That is an optional step. You don't need to do it. I'm just showing it on here. It is an option. You can create flat lava flows and then paint the rocks on top. So you would paint the rocks on top by doing a layer of AK black red and then a layer of AK tenebrous grey over the top, leaving a little bit of that black red just showing through as if it was glowing around the sides. But as I said, that part is optional. You could have just finished at that end part where you've done the orange yellow to red to tenebrous grey. And then all I did quickly was just paint the trim in Army Painter's matte black, and there's the finished effect that we've got of our very quick to do lava effect. You know, we're sort of about 10 minutes in, 10-15 minutes in. Very quickly you can get some nice lava effects on your bases, and you could use that across an entire army. So the next stage is we're going to be sketching in our OSL, our bounce back light from the glowing effects that we've created. So the first colour we're going to use is AK Black Red, and I've heavily watered this down. It's a sort of semi-thick glaze, a 50-50, maybe 70-30 in favour of water for AK Black Red. And what I'm doing now is I'm imagining the light from the lava is shining upwards, and I'm just trying to picture where that would bounce back from the armour, and just laying in quite haphazardly, but not too unpredictable. You need to have some control here of just where I want those reflections to be based on where the lava is on the base. And I just go around and filling those in, adding those. Now you could paint the model first and then do this after, but then you double up on effort and you create some contradictory highlights a little bit later on. We're not going for ultra realism here, but I do like to sometimes portray a little bit of how the light might work when you've got object source lighting and then like gold and metallics next to it. So that I do the bounce back light first so that I know where all of that is and I've got it all laid out, and then I can align my next highlights with it so that you don't get those contrary highlights. You don't waste time painting areas and then overpaint areas. So this is a good way of starting to lay down your object source lighting first, and then you can work with it on the remaining of the model. So these next sequences are just me placing the black red where I want the highlights of the lava bounce back light to be. Remembering that you're glazing this paint on, so it is quite wet, so try not to put too much on the brush, and always try and remember to drag that paint towards the area where you want it to be brightest, because the most paint is left where you leave the brush from the model. And just work yourself around. Try and leave that matte black in some of the darkest recesses where that light wouldn't reach. Try and leave it as black. The idea we're trying to sell here is a nice contrast between the very, very dark and the very, very bright. So to have very, very bright areas, you have to have those dark areas. And sometimes it's best to have very, very dark areas next to very, very bright areas, because it helps sell the intensity of both light and dark very, very quickly, and could say realistically. But in model painting, we rely heavily on contrast. We must have those differences in light and dark areas so that items stand out a lot easier to our eyes, because it's really small to pick out some of these finer details. So when you have contrast, like edge highlighting, areas between light and dark, it helps sell the overall effect. So we've laid down our first reflections of where we want that bounce back lighting to be. What we're going to do now is add our sort of first highlight of our bounce back, and that's using AK Blood Red, but you could use the Warhammer Evil Sun Scarlet, which is an amazing colour. Blood Red and Evil Sun Scarlet are pretty much identical, both really intense red colours. Now again, I've thinned the paint down a little bit, probably 50-50 in favour of like water to paint. And what I'm doing now is I'm adding the highlight within the original highlight, so leaving some of that black red around the surrounding areas of where obviously the glow reflection is. There's a couple of things to remember here. Is we need to leave some of that black red surrounding these highlights that we're doing, but you also need to let the highlight flow, so that there on the bottom of his shoe you can see there's a recess because the shoe bit dips in. But if the angle of the sort of leg plate and the sort of round sphere at the bottom of it is the same, you'd have a natural highlight all the way down it, just leaving the recess in those darker in those recessed areas. There's also an opportunity to leave some areas just black red where there is no main highlight, but it's because it's far away from the lava. What I try and do is make sure that where I've got this bounce back highlighting over a metallic like a gold or a silver, that is always given the higher highlight color. So on the trim of his leg there, I'm painting all of that with this blood red, because for me the metallics bounce back the reflections of the lava more intensely than some of the matte areas of the materials or bone or the armor. So I like to show that those areas are like really metallic by them being one of the areas that really shine under the glow, which is why we've got some of that glow on his staff and on some of the trinkets that are coming off from his arms and the sort of bottom of that sort of like little skull sword that he's got. So the idea now is, as I said, work around highlighting that initial highlight that we've done, making sure that we have the highlight on the metallic areas, and that we try and produce a more realistic approach to where these highlights are based off of where we've sketched in our highlights. It takes a bit of time, so the paint is thinned down a little bit, so you might have to do a few layers building up that intensity. But very quickly you can start to see, and when you're painting this yourself, you'll start to see that it really works. We've not used any fluorescent colours on these bounce lightings, but we're getting the effect that that lava is pushing light upwards and it's reflecting back off of the Chaplain. Once you're happy with the intensities, you saw there I was going backwards and forwards, adding more and more layers to certain areas where I wanted that intensity to grow. This is where we're going to introduce some fluorescence, but to do that we have to go back to our white like we've done before. We use white as the base for our fluorescence. So as I've mentioned previously, I've got two rules when I'm doing my highlights. I want them nice and bright where they're very close to the source of the light, and I also want them nice and bright where that reflection is over metallics. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding little bits of white around the areas that are closest to that glow, and on the metallic areas where that light would be really heavily bouncing back. So you can follow along here where I'm doing it. You can see some of the pictures at the end of where these highlights are, but I'm ensuring that where the area is metallic, I'm adding a little spot of this, of the white, so that when I apply my fluorescence over the top, you get a really nice glowing effect to sort of show that they are metallic and they're bouncing the light back more intensely than the surrounding flatter, matter areas. I then go back and I start using the Green Stuff World fluorescent red again. And now the idea is I paint this over the white that we've just added and a little bit around the surrounding areas. So a lot like we did with the fluorescent yellow on the lava base, we're doing the same now with the fluorescent red. In some areas, like towards the bottom here, I'm using the fluorescent red over the entirety, so covering the black red and the blood red and the white in this fluorescent red, because it helps intensify that bounce back lighting effect that we're going for. So just work yourself around, cover it in the fluorescent red. Sometimes you might need a couple of layers, but it is handy to leave a little bit of that white showing with maybe one layer of fluorescent red over the top of it, because what we're going to be doing after this is adding even more intensity to the metallic areas. So we're almost there. I now use some AK fluorescent orange, and on the areas that you painted white that were either very close to the glowing effect or the metallics, add a little bit of this fluorescent orange to it, and again it helps sell the effect we're going for, that those areas are metal and they're really reflective. And there we have it, all pretty much real time. What I've shown you what I'm doing. An hour in, or less than an hour, maybe 45 minutes, and we've got a nice looking lava base and some object source lighting on our Chaplain. So even though the lava base was done with an airbrush, we've got some object source lighting done by a brush with some lovely gradients. So the next big phase on this is our non-metallic metal. So I'm going to be doing a non-metallic metal bronze type copper look to match how the Chaplin's artwork in some of the books. So there's many layers to non-metallic metal, starting from your darks to your lights. This is my bronze gold recipe. It uses a few colours, but it means we don't generally have to do any mixing. And what you'll see, the reason I've done my object source lighting first is because I can now do my non-metallic metal and work up to the object source lighting that we've laid down. So we can have a nice dark gap between the non-metallic metal highlights, so that you would get that natural thing that happens, that where the lava reflections have stopped, you would have a line of shadow, and then your other colours would take over. Because otherwise, if you had a highlight right next to your object source lighting, it's like, well, it doesn't work. Your eye can't pick out the distinction between the two. So we've got a layer of shadow that we're adding now by not painting anything on that area and moving into our non-metallic metal colours. So the first colour we're using is AK Whole Red, and the idea here is anything that you want to be coppery bronze is to lay down a layer of this whole red. If that, like the trim was on the first leg I painted, if it's near an area where there's object source lighting, leave a tiny gap of that original matte black in between your whole red and your object source lighting, so that you get that natural shadow area. And just work around the model, picking out all of the items. You can leave some of that matte black in the deepest recesses. Now I'm trying to keep, the idea here is that the lava and the object source lighting are some of the brightest points on this model, and that the non-metallic metal generally doesn't get any brighter than the lava. Even with our main highlight, we try and stay a little bit not as bright as our lava effects, so that we're selling the lava effects and the glow rather than the non-metallic metal. If you were painting this in normal metallics, same principles. When you're adding your golds or your bronze, leave that gap between your bounce back reflections and the gold or whatever silver or metallic color you're painting. On these larger, flatter areas, when it comes to doing highlights, like on his Crozius on the side panels, I do different glazes just to help the paint to blend a bit easier. But for this whole red, we're just laying down a full coat over everything. So once that first layer of whole red is laid down, don't forget any sort of these smaller areas. There's some bits on his gloves, around on his belts. There's a few little trinkets here and there. The first layer of our highlight will be with AK medium rust. There's not much tonal difference between the whole red and medium rust. With these paints, I always thin it down a little bit, a little drop of water in there to get some translucency. And now with our medium rust we generally edge highlight everything with the medium rust. And this is our first highlight, so we leave a little bit of the whole red showing, but we are covering a majority of it with the medium rust. So yeah, here we are with the medium rust colour. None of our principles have changed. We're now wanting the paint to get brighter where we want our highlights to be. Making sure we do an edge highlight. We maintain that gap between our whole red and the object source lighting that we've created. This is where we can start to create a little few shapes and some texture if you want to, some battle damage. So nothing always has to be a straight line. You can make it a little bit scratchy, a little bit pot marked, just to give some distinction. If you're doing flat areas, you can paint a bit of like sort of 2/3 and then do a sort of stabby dotty approach to get a blend going through with the two. But what we do now is with this medium rust, we're adding in our first highlight, is that we're pulling the paint down towards where we want our highlight to be, remembering that more paint is left where we leave our brush. And always remember to do your edge highlight. So our secondary highlight is going to be with AK light rust. So we cover a smaller area now. Again, we do an edge highlight, adding a highlight to any of those textures that we've added. So this is on a smaller area. We leave, now we've got the whole red into the medium rust. Now we go into the light rust. Thin down as usual. Drop of water in with your paint. Give it a good mix. Remembering to do our edge highlights and all the principles that we've maintained during the painting of this model. Next highlight is with AK Pastel Peach. Need a little bit of water in this. It's a very odd colour. Too much water and it will thin out too much. It's not very pigment rich. It's a very desaturated orange colour. And this is only used on very small areas. A subtle edge highlight around the initial point of highlight that you're doing. So for me, I was imagining the sunlight is coming down from his top left shoulder, so the gun shoulder is shining down there, and any highlights are going to be picked up on those top edges, which is why that top edge there is quite bright. The bottom edge of his armour is quite bright. So with this Pastel Peach, we don't do a complete edge highlight, we just do a partial edge highlight a few steps up from where our main highlight is going to be. Some areas that are very bright you can do a full highlight like I've done there, but then just infill the areas where you want it to be brightest. It does take a lot of practice. Non-metallic metal is not for everybody, but I sometimes find where you've got object source lighting, having the non-metallic metal with the highlights now, it works a lot better sometimes than having standard metallics. But again, the thing that sells it is that gap between your bounce back object source lighting, so that red that we've created on the model, then that line of shadow, and then your follow-up color next to it. Having that gap of shadow really helps sell both highlights either side. So our final highlight is with AK Ice Yellow, and this is just used tiny little dots just where our very, very bright points are going to be. This is pretty much the brightest we're going to get on our non-metallic metals. Any brighter and we would start drawing the eye away from the lava effects that we've created. You only need a very small dots of this right in the central points of where you want your highlight to be. Sometimes picking out the little rivets and spikes that would naturally pick up the light is a good idea as well. But again, less is more. Try and picture where that light is going to be bouncing back on the spikes. And if you've got a highlight like we've got there on the bottom, on the sort of the top of his pauldron, there's a spike right next to it that would also be catching a little bit of light. You could go on for days and days. The principles of non-metallic metal and bounce back lighting and spherical lighting, and to do it realistically takes a lot of time and effort. I'm trying to do it because these models will be used not only as showcase pieces but also on the battlefield. So I don't generally go for ultra realistic highlights. I just like to do highlights in line with how the model is moving to the sort of backgrounds and the bases that we've created. So I'm at a point now where I want to just add some shadows back in, just to tone down some areas, help them blend in with those definitions that we've got. So I'm going to use some AK Tenebrous Grey, and what I've done is I've heavily watered it down to create a wash. So that's 1 part paint, probably 10 parts water. And what I'm doing here is I'm just glazing some of that paint in from the whole red into where that shadow area was next to the black red that we've got. I'd also be using this AK Tenebrous Grey wash just to create some shadow areas from our original whole red to make darkening it down, especially around some of the rivets into those deeper recesses. And it just helps separate some items as well, and bring definition, because like we've mentioned, you need a lot of contrast. So where we've got a shadow, if we've got that right next to a bright point, it's really good. And this Tenebrous Grey works very well as a shadow colour. You could just use Nuln Oil, but water it down a little bit, otherwise it could be a little bit too intense. And don't get it over any of your highlights, it will wash them out and you need to go back and re-highlight. So just be pushing and pulling this paint into your recesses and doing your transitions. Just remembering that rule with glazes, where you remove your brushes where the most paint is left. So if you're pulling it down over to the right into a shadow, when you move that brush away, most of the paint will be left and you get that nice natural glazing transition over your layers. So for the next part, annoyingly, I forgot to press the record button, and it was for the non-metallic silver. But there's not too much, and it is very simple, and I've covered it off in other videos, which I'll link in the description. For the non-metallic silver, I base coated everything in AK Dark Sea Blue, and then to get brighter, all I did was added white into that. No other colours, just white. And you can see my transitional colours there. So it was almost a 70-30, then a 50-50, and then maybe a 30-70 in favour of white, just to get your transitions from your dark colours to your bright colours. I will leave links for the descriptions for how to do it in other videos, but it is very straightforward with that dark sea blue and white. For the parchments, I base coat in mud brown, and then I do a highlight in light earth. There's quite a lot of parchments on this guy, so just work yourself around, base coat them in AK light earth, and then do highlights with AK. Base coat them in AK mud brown, and then do an overall highlight with light earth. As I've said before in other tutorials, with parchments you can use any stony, bony type colour just to get brighter and brighter as you do. And I also do the same for his skull. So I base it in AK mud brown. I then do a sort of 50-50 mix of mud brown and light earth to do the highlights around the eyes, the nose and the teeth. I then just move into pure light earth for the final highlight for the skull. can even use a little bit of white just to highlight the teeth. And we'll be adding some glowing effects to his eyes a little bit later anyway, to bring some attention to the face. So just to finish the parchments off, we're just going to paint the waxes, and for that I base coat them in AK Magenta and then just do little edge highlights with AK Intense Pink. For the Crozier staff, I base coat that in violet red and then do a highlight in magenta. So the violet red is from Vallejo. For any leather, which is the sort of next stage here, you can see me quickly doing some non-metallic silver just on the book, just that dark sea blue, and then adding a little bit of white here and there. It's a really nice quick recipe. Yeah, for the leather, we base coat in grim brown. We do first highlight in leather brown and then a final highlight in saddle brown. I think it's just the leather book. There's a little bit on the gum pouch as well. There's not too much leather on this guy. To highlight the armour, I'm first of all going to use good old AK Dark Sea Blue, and this I just use as a thick edge highlight just to make sure I go around all the black armour, leaving a gap again between our red bounce back lighting that we've created. We want to leave that shadow gap in between, so when you're doing these highlights, just make sure you leave a little bit of a gap if it's going to come across the source lighting that we've just done. And just work yourself around the model, just picking out any edges and any shapes with the dark sea blue. I then use some AK graphite, which is sort of Mechanicus standard grey. It's just a neutral grey colour. Thin it down just so it flows off the brush easier. And where I've got the dark sea blue highlights, this graphite highlight is done on a very smaller scale. So you do a highlight within a highlight on the points that you want to be most bright. Some of those sharper edges that would have caught the light. So you do some of that dark sea blue and you cover probably about a third of it in the graphite. And here I'm just going to be painting the Crozius, as I mentioned, so base coating it in violet red. And where you've got the little diamond shapes, I paint little bits of those in the AK magenta just for a subtle highlight. we could be adding just some finishing touches to the model now, just to get some more glowing effects going. So the first are going to be some more red glowing effects. So we use AK wine red, AK blood red at first. So like we've done where we've created hot and cold, our cold is the wine red, moving all the way up to our fluorescence for the hot colours. So the little gem on this belt buckle, I paint the whole area with the wine red. The eye sockets of the skull, I paint all of the eye sockets with the wine red. And also the gaps in his chest armour, like his ribs, I paint those in the wine red also. And the glowing effects on the vents on his backpack, I also paint those entire areas with AK wine red. They, like we did with the black red on the armour, this wine red is the similar effect that we're going for. That it's the coolness of the heat coming from the exhaust vents and the sort of the glow from inside of his helmet. So I paint the inside as an aquila on the skull as well. I paint that with the wine red. So to create our first sort of glow effect, we use AK blood red. So I paint the entirety of the gem in the blood red. I then paint the bottom 2/3 of the rib gaps with the blood red, pushing the paint towards the bottom side. I paint the full eye itself in the blood red, and then the central points of the vents on the back I paint in blood red. To get the fluorescence to work, we have to use the white. So where you want it to be most bright, you add a little dot of white, so a little dot in the center of the gem, a little dot in the bottom corners of the chest rib vents, little dots on the eyes, and dots of white in the vents round the back. Then use our good old green stuff well fluorescent red and just paint over the entirety of the sort of wine red and blood red with the fluorescent red, trying to push the paint towards the white so that you get most of the fluorescent finishing on the white. Then we hit it with some fluorescent orange, so wherever you painted white, just touch those areas with a little bit of fluorescent orange to complete the glowing effects. So the next stage is optional, but I just wanted to do it on the backpack just to add some insane orange glow. We're going to use a sort of oil enamel based fluorescent. It's very, very intense colour. It's AK Wargame enamel. I use an old liner brush. This stuff dries really, really intensely, and I just do little touches of it on the very inside of the backpack, just so that you get a nice intense orange glow. That is optional. You could, if you wanted, just use a bit of white, watered down white, and then go over the top of it with some fluorescent orange. But really, it is a non-optional stage. I just did it to add some extra intensity. You have to be careful with this stuff. It dries really, really bright. It doesn't look it when you apply it, but when you dry, it's really intense. And that was the final stage. So yeah, painted the rim black so you get a nice contrast, and there we have it, the Space Marine Chaplain with a nice lava base, some object source lighting, some non-metallic metals, both silver and bronze, and some lovely glowing effects as well. So we've got really good contrast between the object source lighting, the non-metallic metals, the lava on the base, the glowing effects. Everything's got shadows and lights, so each little part stands out and combines to a really cool looking model on the battlefield. Really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I loved painting this miniature. It's really good. Love doing the object source lighting and the lava effects, especially with the speed that we can do it at, using the airbrush and then using brushwork to lay down our volumetric lighting, bounce back lighting. Subscribe, like, add comments, ask me questions. I'm always available. Your support just keeps me going. It's so greatly appreciated what you guys give back to the channel. There will be more tutorials to follow as always. At the end of the video will be a separate slide showing all the colours that have been used. There's not that many. Most of them we use really on the lava and the non-metallic metals. So yeah, happy painting, my fellow painters.